First, I just want to give a very brief overview of what Safe Gatherings is and why we're talking about this right now. And then after I explain kind of the nitty gritty into that, we'll go over what the policy means, how to set up dashboards, all those pieces. And then any questions questions that you have, if you'll either put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, I'm not going to look at those until I'm done explaining kind of the overall, and then we'll go through those individually and make sure that those questions are answered. If you have technical issues, go ahead and put it in the chat. It is being monitored by someone besides me. And so if you're having issues hearing or seeing things, just making sure that that's being seen. Otherwise, if you have a question, just pop it in there as it comes, and then we'll talk about it. So very beginning, Safe Gatherings came about starting in January of this year. We had a special called session of the annual conference to deal with some of the matters concerning the Boy Scouts of America's lawsuits and a lot of the kind of end piece of that resolution. There were three parts to that resolution that was passed at the special annual conference in January, one of which was to form a task force that would evaluate the safety measures and the recommendations of our conference for local churches, both for conference events, but also for local churches. So the task force got together, they met for about 6 months, and in June at annual conference, the regularly scheduled annual conference, we presented what we found to be and recommended as an updated policy and a recommendation of a particular company called Safe Gatherings to use to create a more standardized system for background checks and for training our volunteers and the people who work with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. As part of this whole policy that was passed at annual conference, there are some new guidelines and some new requirements that are put in place. And so that's what we're going to go over and make sure that everyone understands. But there's a few differences in the different groups of people who need to do what and some new deadlines. And so I want to make sure to highlight those. So overall, we can know one of the big pieces in the dates is that everything is now in effect. Effective October 1st, the policy went into effect. And so now, instead of the resolution that was passed many, many years ago that everyone should have a safe sanctuary policy, that has shifted now into we are recommending based on an Arkansas Conference Safe Gatherings policy. Our policy as a conference gives guidelines for what churches could be doing as a minimum standards, but we also give guidelines for what is required for particular groups of people, specifically required for clergy and required for those who participate in district and conference sponsored events that are intended for children and youth. And so while a lot of these things are suggestions and very strongly encouraged, some of them are required, and we're going to break all of that down. So the very first thing that I want to explain is when we talk about the words Safe Gathering Certified, what does that mean? And so in the past, every church has had kind of a different definition of what it means to be either Safe Sanctuary Certified, or it means to be Safety Certified or Risk Management Certified. And so we have broken that down into what it means to be Safe Gathering Certified. Means that you've completed the process that includes a background check, a clergy reference check, a lay reference check, an Arkansas DHS child maltreatment registry check, and you've completed the online training. And so when all of those pieces are collected, they're approved through Safe Gathering staff that all the databases have been checked and everything's completed, then you're marked as complete, and you are then Safe Gathering certified for 3 years until it's time to renew all of those pieces. So when we talk about being certified, we're implying that a particular number of steps have not only been taken care of, but that you've been approved. And so that that a human being has laid eyes to see that all of these things are done, that your background check came back clear, and that we've addressed any issues that did pop up, that you've completed the online training, you made an 80% on the quiz at the end of the training, and everything's good to go. So the process of this means that there's all online work now. So Safe Gatherings, part of the advantage of all of this is not only that it's standard and that we know exactly what is covered in the background check, we know exactly what's covered in the training, but it's all online and it is user based. So instead of individuals at churches collecting information or collecting forms and then processing themselves, instead you send instructions to the people who need to complete this certification, and they walk through the instructions themselves. And those instructions are in that document that I linked. But there are instructions that are particular for lay people, and there are instructions that are particular for clergy people, because you select different things in some of the questions that you answer. And part of that process is that then whoever is applying to be certified is then completing all of that information themselves. They're putting in all of their personal information to create an account. They're putting in their personal information to run the background check. They're putting in the name and email address of their references that they would like to be contacted for a reference. And that reference includes, it is an email that is sent to your clergy person that you put down and your lay person that you put down. They get an email that says, so-and-so has listed you as a reference. Please answer these questions. I think it's maybe 10 questions, maybe 12. They're very standard, either scaled or yes or no. And it takes about anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to complete a reference. And then when it's completed, it goes into the system, and Safe Gatherings knows that that's been done. And so if for some reason one of your references doesn't get that email, you put in the email incorrectly, or they decide, delete, I'm not doing that, and it doesn't get done, any of those things, you're going to get a reminder that your references haven't been done. And after the first reminder, if they're still not done within a week after that, so 2 weeks after you put it in, they'll send you an email that says, so-and-so hasn't responded. Do you want to put in a new person? And so it continues to automatically prompt you without the work being put on the leaders who are coordinating these ministries and these volunteers in the local level. So rather than you having to track people down, what we're hoping is this creates a system to where once you've given them the link to the instructions to use, they're going step by step. And then once it's set up, Safe Gatherings is doing the follow-up and follow through. After you do the references, the most involved piece is that we have now integrated the child maltreatment check that has always been a requirement, a recommendation as part of the background check system that we have recommended in the past. But instead, Safe Gatherings has written code in order to include all of this in one place. So instead of completing all of your background check pieces and all your training pieces and then having to go separate to a separate site to do all of the maltreatment pieces and do it on its own, it's all in one place. So it's a little involved, and that's why it's important to use the laity or the clergy instructions, because it gives you very clear instructions on how to fill that out and what to do. But the basic is that you'll be directed to the website for the Arkansas Child Maltreatment Registry. It'll ask you some specific questions. The way to answer those are listed in the instructions. At the end, it will give you an option to give an email address. And when you say complete, then the form, it's basically like it fills out the form for you with your answers that you've given. It emails you a copy of that form to the email address you give. You print that out, you get it notarized, and then you upload it back into the Safe Gatherings system. And so then they take care of all of that. They send it to the DHS. DHS we have our own database for the Arkansas Conference. And so they upload everything that's approved and marked completed in that database, and Safe Gatherings checks all of those pieces, which means that it takes all the work away from you having to track down paperwork, from uploading, from finding a notary, all of those pieces. And so that's the most complicated piece, but it doesn't have to be complicated as long as you kind of know what steps you're taking. We've included instructions in there about how to turn a picture of a document. If you would take a picture of your document with your phone, both for iPhones and Androids, how to turn them into PDFs, because that's the one catch, is PDFs are the only form that can be uploaded, because that's what's required by DHS. But we have instructions on that piece too. So we hope we've made that as easy as possible. And then the other piece is the training. The training is both, it reads it to you, and you can read it to yourself with it muted, depending on if you're more of a visual or auditory learner. It goes through 12 modules of safety. Some of it is heavy material. And so if you have particular people who might be triggered by some of the heavy material discussed, you might give them a heads up. But it's great training. It's great comprehensive coverage about every age level, including vulnerable and elderly adults. And so It's a training that takes approximately 2 hours to get through. If you go all the way through, at any point, if you stop and then you log back in to start up, it'll start where you stopped, so you don't have to keep starting over. It has checkpoints throughout just to make sure that you're keeping up and paying attention. And then at the end, it gives you a quiz of 20 questions. And in order to say that you have passed training, you have to have an 80% on that. If you, for some reason, fail or you answer incorrectly on some accidentally or whatever else, you can go back and take the quiz again after kind of looking over some things again. Overall, this whole process could take somewhere between probably 2.5 and 3 hours by the time you fill out all the paperwork online. It can all be done in parts, but we do recommend recognizing that even though you could complete it in about 2 or 3 hours, it still takes anywhere from 7 to 14 days for all of the pieces to be checked and to be approved. So if you have a deadline for when you should be approved, we want to make sure you start early enough that you meet that deadline. And so some people are getting theirs back and approved within the next day. Some are taking about 2 weeks, depending on how much information, how many addresses you have to check, how many children you have to check through the registry, things like that. And so we want to make sure that you know that this is not a same day process. It's not like in the past where you could put in a social security number on a website from Google and it spit back out a report. There's a little bit more involved to that. Let's see. Oh, for those of you who are looking for notaries, we are working on providing a list. So some churches have administrators or they have they have members who are notaries through their other secular work. Local banks have notaries. Most local libraries have notaries. And so in addition to that, we recognize that some churches who don't have access to that have churches that are close by that might have notary. And so there's now a map on the webpage for Safe Gatherings where you can click and find a church with a notary that's close to you with instructions on how to contact them and coordinate getting your form notarized. And we're continuing to work on that. And so one of the links at the end of that list that I put in the chat is if you happen to be a notary or if you know a notary and your church would be willing, that person in your church would be willing to be listed. If they can fill that out, we'll add them to that map. Okay, let's talk about who has to do this and who doesn't and all those things in between. So the policy that was passed has some requirements for particular people. Those groups of people are all clergy that are appointed, which means they are assigned in an appointment to a church, or lay people who are assigned, and that would be lay supply or certified lay ministers. So clergy who are appointed or lay people who are assigned are all people who must go through the certification process no later than December 31st. And then we have another group of people. So it is required that if you are a part of a church who is going to bring children and youth to events as an adult chaperone, to events that are district and conference sponsored for children and youth. So for example, Refuge is coming up as a Conference Council on Youth Ministries, a CCYM event. If you are an adult chaperone coming to Refuge Weekend 1 or Refuge Weekend 2, you must be Safe Gathering certified. If you're going to participate in the children's event, one of the Central District events that's coming up in November is the Bible Boot Camp. If you are going to be an adult chaperone to Bible Boot Camp through the Central District, because that event is intended for children, you must be Safe Gathering certified. Now we have the special called session of annual conference coming up in Hot Springs in November. That event is not intended for children and youth. Therefore, you do not have to be Safe Gathering certified to attend that, even though you're an adult and you're attending a conference event, because that conference event is not intended for children and youth. These are events where you are bringing children and youth because that is the event for them and you are coming as an adult chaperone. So that would include Veritas, Junior and Senior High Assembly. It'll include, if you're a chaperone on choir tour, it includes Refuge. It will include any of the district events. If you have a youth rally, that's a district event. If you have a children's Bible boot camp, eventually if we come back with Quest for the children in September, things like that. Those are all events that would be, adult chaperones would be required for that. And so right now, the deadline for that is October 31st, because we have those 3 events in November. We have the 2 Refuge weekends and we have the Bible boot camp. And then after that, it's basically you just better be certified before you go to your next event. So our next event will be Veritas. And so before you attend Veritas, you must be Safe Gathering certified so that that can be double checked and verified for as part of the registration process. It is strongly encouraged, even though it's not required, for other lay folks to use this certification system in the local church setting. And that would include paid church staff, and it would include your local church volunteers. So if you have volunteers who work in the children's program because they help out in the nursery, because they are Sunday school teachers, because they help teach Wednesday night Bible studies, because they're youth volunteers, because they might chaperone a local church retreat, because they lead small groups, because all the different things of people, of volunteers who work with children and youth with that children's and youth local church programming. We hope that you will use Safe Gatherings as your system for verifying those volunteers and their background checks and having them trained appropriately. We are so strongly encouraging this that the conference recognizes that there is an added expense to all of this. It's $61 a person because that includes all the background checks, that includes a DMV check, and it includes the training access. And so we are paying for all local church volunteers, even if those volunteers are not necessarily coming to a district or conference event for children and youth, even if they're just working in your local level ministries, but we will pay for their checks. They just have to ensure that in the instructions, when it says application type, that they pick local church volunteer, and that will get billed to the conference. The only group of people that we are strongly recommending but not paying for is local church staff. Some of the theory in that is that hopefully most churches have already, as part of their personnel policies, are doing basic background checks on their employees. And so that shouldn't add as much of an expense. But we do hope that if your church is going to choose to use Safe Gatherings as its main system for background checks, that it would apply across the board. And so again, those checks are $61 per person. The only checks that a church will have to pay for is if they choose to have their paid staff persons checked. Their clergy people are paid for by the Board of Ordained Ministry. Their volunteers are paid for by the conference. One thing to note is that if you've had volunteers or paid staff have background checks in the last 3 years, so since January 1st of 2020, then they are considered as part of that group, like just like you would to be kind of grandfathered in. So let's say you had your check 6 months ago. So it's 2.5 years before you need your next check. And so you can add them to the list of people who would need to get checked in, I can't do 6 months in my head. So April of 2024, or no, 2025, sorry. I'm still in 2021. Basically, add 3 years to get to that number. So those can be grandfathered in. So it's not as if you've had some volunteer checks already done this year or the year before, you could easily wait, and so that you're not taking on all of that at once. If you want to start with everybody on the same page, we get that, and that's perfectly fine. It's just up to you and your policy that your church needs to talk through of how you want to use Safe Gatherings. Let's see. I'm looking at my notes, make sure I'm covering all my bases. Let's talk a little bit about policy. So one of the questions that I've had a couple of times is, do you have to have an actual Safe Gatherings policy versus a policy that you've always had? And there's a yes or no. So yes, you have to have a Safe Gatherings policy if you are a church that is going to be bringing children or youth to children and youth events. Just like we just talked about of what those events count as for your adults to be certified, you have to have a true Safe Gatherings policy in order that you upload to your dashboard, and we'll talk about a dashboard in just a minute, that we can identify and recognize that you've created and is uploaded before you attend an event. Now, a Safe Gatherings policy we have minimum standards that are listed in the policy, and there's a link to that in that document, the ARUMC Safe Gatherings policy. Under I think it's on page 2, it lists the basics that the policy has to have to be a Safe Gatherings policy. And the major difference in a Safe Gatherings policy versus any other safety policy that has already been in place in churches is that you are designating Safe Gatherings, the company, as the only company that you're using to certify your volunteers through background checks and training. It means that you are saying specifically, we are going to use this specific program to background check and to train our volunteers. And that's what makes it a Safe Gatherings policy, because you have designated, rather than saying a generic, all volunteers should be background checked, all volunteers should be trained. And so in the Safe Gatherings piece, when you add that level and add it and call it a Safe Gatherings policy, then you are stating in that policy that your standard is a Safe Gatherings certification, which includes the background check, the DMV check, the maltreatment check, the reference checks, and the training. And so that designates exactly what that is. So for those of you who would not be participating, if you're not going to be bringing children and youth, you could maintain the policy that you have. We do recommend that you check that new policy from the Arkansas Conference, just to make sure you've hit all of the minimum standards. And they're very basic in terms of procedure. It's the 2-adult rule. It's making sure you have a policy in place, making sure you have someone in charge who is checking to make sure that things are being followed. There's not a whole lot of minimum standards, but there are a few that we think that any policy for any church should include. For those of you who want to go back and edit those and make them into Safe Gatherings policies, again, the major thing is to make sure that you meet the minimum standards laid out in the Arkansas Conference policy. And then you can add as a local church whatever you need. If you have special circumstances that you want to address. Some churches have very detailed procedures that they write out, all of the different things that have to happen at overnight events, all the different things that have to happen for checkout, check-in, all of those pieces, bathroom procedures and things like that. And that is fine. We do not have those minimum standards because every church is different and every church has different groups of people that they're working with. You can add whatever you need, and then your board of trustees can pass that policy and adopt it. And that be your Safe Gatherings policy. But we just provided a list of some very basic pieces that need to be a part of a policy. You do not, again, have to have a Safe Gatherings policy unless you're going to be bringing children and youth to participate in district and conference events. Right now, the charge conference forms ask for a Safe Gatherings policy, but what that means is it's how it's always been. That language changed a little bit sooner than it probably needed to make it make sense. But basically, you need to be attaching the document that says what your risk management plan is for children, youth, and vulnerable adults at your church. That could be the policy that's already been in place. That could be the policy that you update to add Safe Gatherings. That could be the policy you have in place for now, and then you can update it in the coming months and then add it to your dashboard that we're about to talk about anytime between now and Kingdom Come. So let's talk about dashboard. So if you haven't already, you should be designating someone at your church as the Safe Gatherings coordinator, which is basically the contact person that's going to be on your account with Safe Gatherings. That can be your church administrator, that can be a children's worker, that can be a youth worker, that can be, it can be your pastor if it needs to be. It just needs to be the person who's going to answer some basic questions with Safe Gatherings, and the person that if you do use Safe Gatherings to certify paid staff that can know how to pay for it. And so they can either put a credit card on file, or they know where the invoice comes to make sure that it gets paid. So to set up your dashboard, there's an 800 number that's included in that document that I linked in the chat. And you'll just call that number. You'll tell them your name, what church you're with. They'll ask you some very basic questions. They'll get your admin set up. So you'll get an email with an administrator login. So you'll have your own personal login to make sure that you're certified, and you can go through the whole process yourself, but then you'll have an admin login, and that will allow you to log in to see anybody in your church who's been certified, if they're pending or if they're complete. You can run reports. So if you want to see everybody that's certified in the last year, you can see everybody that's coming up for certification next year. You can run all sorts of reports, but it lets you know which adults are certified. People who can see the church dashboard cannot see any personal information. You can't see social security numbers. You can't see their application. You can't pull up. You can't get dirt on anybody. You can just see if they're done, and you can see the date that they're finished. You can also search, if you search a name in particular, for someone else within the conference. So let's say someone joins your church from another United Methodist Church, and they decide that they're going to start coming to your church and they want to volunteer with the youth. You could search to see if they are already certified through another church. You could verify it with them. You can use that information how you need to, but it helps us also track around to make sure that we're not running checks on the same person multiple times just because of movement. The dashboard, you can have as many admins as you need. They try to limit that to where it's not, like every person in the church can see it. But if you have an administrator, if you have someone who works with children and a separate person who works with youth, you could have three. You could do, however you need to look at that. But you can always add or subtract admins just by calling that number and talking to them. The setup initially for dashboard takes maybe 5 minutes. So it's very easy to take care of. And then that way they make sure that they have the correct address, they have all the correct information for who's going to be the contact person. It starts out where they have the pastor listed, but if the pastor isn't going to be the one taking care of the nitty-gritty details, then that needs to be changed to who the appropriate person is. I will say, you do not have to have a church dashboard set up before people in your church start the certification process. So if you have volunteers, especially that are going to Refuge or Bible Boot Camp and they need to go ahead and get started, you don't have to wait on your administrator or whoever's going to be that designated person to call and set things up. It doesn't take very long to set it up, but you don't have to wait on that. It will go into the system automatically. You can select the church and it'll still put you in your church. And so when that dashboard is set up, it'll be there ready for you. A few advantages. We've talked a little bit about the ease of it, the fact that it's all online, it's much more private. You don't have to hold on to information. Their servers hold all the information indefinitely. So if you do have an issue that ever pops up and you need verification of when they did a background check, that everything was checked, that it wasn't flagged, or whatever you need, that is held permanently, and you request that from Safe Gatherings and they'll get you all of the documents that you would need for like a court or lawsuit at any point. We hope that doesn't happen, but the reason that we do this is to ensure that we have followed procedure if necessary. You can see who's certified very easily. So it would be easy that if you're trying to, fill the last minute spot, you could easily pull a report and say, okay, these are the people that are already done and I can choose from to start calling, things like that. It sends automatic reminders. So in 45 days before the 3-year mark is up, it'll start sending reminders automatically to the people who need to re-up, and they'll say, it's time to redo this. If you're still working in a capacity with children, youth, or young adult or vulnerable adults in a church setting, then you need to start this process. It'll have the link, it'll send them ready to go, and they log back in, do all this stuff again, and then they're certified again. You don't have to be keeping up with that. So once you've prompted someone to start the process and giving them the instructions, it kind of keeps them in the system and it takes care of all the reminders. It reminds them if their reference pieces isn't done. If they start the process and they don't finish it for some reason, it'll prompt them and remind them like, hey, you got started, but you haven't finished this part. Are you still working on this? It automatically follows up it sends reminders to references. If something comes back crazy, there are people that are working on, like human people who are working on that side of it and are kind of watching, and they'll call and say, hey, did you mean to select this? Or I had one last week where somebody hit the wrong button and said, I do not recommend this person instead of I recommend this person. And they promptly called and said, hey, this is what you answered. Did you mean this? And they were like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. No, obviously I answered everything else positively. I just hit the wrong button. And they corrected that and got it handled so that it didn't slow down the process for that applicant. It provides much more consistent checks. We now know, we know that anybody that's going to be present at a district or conference event is going to have the same type of background check. It's going to be completed. And we're not just taking a word for it that the same level has been taken care of. We know that all the training and understanding of what is appropriate and what is allowed is standard. And so we're not depending on every church's interpretation of what that training could look like. And it provides a training for you. One of the number one questions that I've gotten over the last several years is, do we have any kind of training to give to volunteers? And we've always had to say, well, you kind of have to do that on your own. And now you don't. We have a great training. It is one of the most thorough trainings that I've seen in the safety aspect of things. And so while it is long, it is very comprehensive. It makes some very good points. It gives some practical examples, so it's easy to apply to situations. And I think that it would be very beneficial for anybody who works in these capacities to have the understanding. So I've gotten to the end of my list. And so now I am happy to answer any questions if you want to put them in the Q&A or the chat to clarify anything. If you have specifics that you want to cover, any of that kind of stuff, I'm happy to do that. I do remind you that this is recorded because we're going to have it available for those unable to be here. So if you have very specifics that you don't want to be public, if you want to contact me later and we can talk through those pieces. But outside of that, if you have the question, others probably do too. And so feel free to put it out there.